Elie Wiesel founded Forum 2000 for a purpose.
We have to use the past to not becoming our children's future.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I want to thank President Havel for convening another extraordinary gathering of Forum 2000.
So those people, their peace, our kingdom, more seriously, and we should develop new ideas, and then important is implementation.
Dámy a pánové, vážení přítomní, já vás co nejsrdečněji vítám na konferenci Forum 2000.
The world is upside down. How should we put it back together? Are we able to act responsibly? Can we work together, play by the rules, and restore solidarity? Let's use this crisis as an opportunity. A new world emerging? Watch the online Forum 2000 conference, October 12th to 14th.
Good evening, everybody in Prague, in Europe, elsewhere. Good afternoon in the United States, early afternoon. So we are global online. Forum 2000 conference is organizing a panel to discuss the post-COVID era and possibly also post-Donald Trump era in the United States in particular, with a lot of attention to the foreign policy. So this is the subject of our next 45 minutes discussion. And we do have two excellent speakers from the United States. One is Charles Kupchan, political scientist, member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and also professor at the Georgetown University, who served in the past as the assistant to the two presidents, Bill Clinton. I remember him personally since that era. And then also to Barack Obama. He's also a prominent author of a couple of books, in particular, The End of American Era and No One's World. The other speaker, William Kristol, which is a famous no-conservative political analyst and commentator. He is well known as the founder of the Weekly Standard and now the editor of the Watchwork. We remember Bill very well when he has established the project for the New American Century. And he was a Republican, while Charles is a Democrat. But Bill supporting Ronald Reagan, supporting both Bushes, in particular upholding the campaign of George W. Bush personally. Then once Donald Trump took the stage, so he appeared as one of the very outspoken opponent of Donald Trump, being among those who established this Republican voters against Trump and endorsing very early this year also Joe Biden in the campaigning. So, guys, you have a lot of different views, one Democrat, one neoconservative, but you have also something in common, and that's the criticism of Donald Trump. So my first question to you is that the first, maybe the last term of Donald Trump comes to an end, focusing just on foreign affairs. Just now ignore the domestic policy. What is your brief evaluation? Was it better or even worse than you have expected 4 years ago? And Charles, maybe you are the first.
Sure. Sasha, it's very nice to see you again after a long break. I have very fond memories of working with you back in the 1990s. And Bill, good to see you again. I guess I'll make three brief comments in response, Sasha. The first is that the Trump administration has been much worse than I thought, in that as he campaigned, he made various pledges about America first, about unilateralism, isolationist soundings, protectionism. And I, along with, I think, many of my fellow Americans, believed that he wouldn't deliver on most of it. But he actually has. It's quite disconcerting to me, the degree to which he has implemented a foreign policy, which, at least from where I sit, has done grievous damage to the United States, as well as the rest of the world. And it's not just the substance of the policy. It's not just the trade wars that he's picked, or the fact that he insults our allies and cozies up to autocrats. It's simple lack of decency, of respect, of the degradation of the United States as a model that other countries want to emulate. I think that's particularly costly at a time when Russia and China are essentially attempting to push out an anti-democratic alternative to liberal democracy. The good news is that I don't think that the damage caused by these policies is quite as bad as it could have been, in the sense that NATO is still standing. The basic institutional infrastructure that we inherited from the era of 1941 through Barack Obama, a lot of that is still intact. It's weakened, it's been damaged, but the system itself, to me, shows remarkable resilience, and I take a certain comfort in that. My final comment would be to say that even though I don't care for Mr. Trump or his foreign policies, I think we need to harvest some lessons from the Trump era about the need to address the underlying sources of populism, the future of work, immigration, economic discontent that is causing disconcerted politics on both sides of the Atlantic. And I also think that Trump has spoken to members of the American public that feel the U.S. has overreached. And it's not an accident in my mind that as he campaigns for re-election, he's trying to get out of Syria, get out of Afghanistan, get out of Iraq, downsize Germany. I'm not for all of those policies, but I do think it suggests that a new sweet spot in American politics when it comes to foreign policy may be a somewhat less ambitious role in the world. I'll stop there.
Bill, as a Republican, can you find at least something where you were positively surprised, or your evaluation is more or less the same?
It's similar. Well, first of all, it's good to be with you, Sasha and Charles, and I would love to be there in Prague next year in Prague. Right, we could have a real discussion in person. I think my version, the kind of American foreign policy I want to see is not the one he wanted to see, and his supporters, to the degree that they had thought about it, it's not the one they wanted to see. So I think his instincts have been bad, and he's done a fair amount of damage. He was constrained in two ways. I'll just maybe elaborate a tiny bit on what Charles was saying. One that, two ways I'd say he was constrained. The institutions of the U.S. government constrained him in lots of ways. His early appointees constrained him. They were much more traditional. A lot of those constraints have gone, which is one reason why I am extremely worried, would be extremely worried if Trump were to have a second term. That is, the first 2 years with Mattis and with a lot of other people in place, and a lot of the people left over from previous administrations in place, and Trump uncertain about how to manage the government, that minimized, in a sense, his ability to carry out some of those policies. The Ukraine scandal, in a way, is a perfect example where he didn't actually do what he hoped to do. And the main reason he didn't do what he hoped to do is that a ton of people in the U.S. government, ranging from ambassadors to State Department officials to intelligence community senior officials, didn't let him do what he wanted to do. But they're all gone. They're all gone. Even John Bolton, who was a pretty, on one extreme, you might say, of the more conventional set of foreign policy advocates and officials over the last 20, 30 years, wouldn't go along with what Trump wanted. But Bolton is gone too. So a lot of the internal guardrails in the U.S. government have been removed or weakened. The good news is that they were there. The good news is that they can be restored, I think, and the system remains in some ways in place to restore them. And so that's somewhat hopeful. But again, it makes a second term would be different from a first term. We take for granted that he was checked in all kinds of ways that he wouldn't necessarily be checked if he were reelected and had that kind of vote of confidence and did not have the Jim Mattises of the world and so many others, obviously, around him to H.R. McMaster and many, many, many others. I mean, to prevent certain things or make it harder for him to do certain things. The second point, I think this has been not noticed enough in the U.S. Maybe it has been noticed abroad in Europe and elsewhere. Our allies have bent over backwards to keep I don't know what term we're going to use. Let's just call it the international order, the liberal world order, whatever you want to call it, that's been more or less in effect since 1945, have bent over backwards to keep it together. We don't appreciate this in a way enough here, but whether it's in Asia with Prime Minister Abe, in Europe with Prime Minister Merkel or President Macron, many others, they have swallowed hard, put up with a lot of things that they didn't like, took some hits in terms of domestic politics in many cases, not, speaking back at President Trump or by giving away, making some concessions, because they understood how important it was to keep this order together. They did not want the U.S. to simply exit. They did not want a Trump foreign policy in all of its glory. And so they swallowed hard and tried to make things like NATO work. I was talking with someone the other day, I'm sure Charles knows probably more details than I do, but about one of the early NATO meetings and how Trump behaved, someone who was there, who's left the administration, and the degree to which Stoltenberg and Merkel and Macron, Theresa May at the time, just kind of, if they had gone with their impulses, they would have walked out or chastised him or made a fuss, and they just swallowed hard and said, we just got to put up with this for 4 years. The degree to which Prime Minister Abe really found all kinds of ways to flatter Trump and to keep him from going ahead with what looked like he was going to be quite anti-Japan, didn't like either Japan or China when he was coming into office. The degree to which they went to those efforts is pretty astonishing. Again, that I think worked okay for 4 years. That would be hard to sustain for 8 years. So I think there is life after one term of Trump for a world order that I would like to see preserved and improved in many ways. I'm not sure. A second term really could be a different story.
I will go back to the projection into the future, but now having some small time before another guest will jump with a question, I would have a very quick question and quick answer asking you, in a month, there are the elections. What would I have no doubts that you both are keeping your finger crossed for Joe Biden, but what do you believe would be the key point, the breaking point in the elections? It's the COVID disease, it's economy, or it's China or some foreign policy issue? Just a short answer, both first Charles and then Bill. What do you believe would be the key point of difference in election?
Well, Sasha, to be honest, if it weren't for the pandemic, I would have been quite worried about the outcome of the election. And I agree with Bill that 4 more years of Donald Trump will test the patience of our allies and test the order that has been built. And I too worry about what we both call the guardrails of American democracy. I'm not sure that the system would continue to function if Donald Trump is reelected. It's already been stressed, but I really would fear about the future of democracy in the country if Trump is reelected. But I do think that what is happening right now with the country effectively reeling from the pandemic, with the Trump administration quite visibly and unarguably having dropped the ball on dealing with the pandemic, with people out of work, with people not going to school. I think the average American is basically said, this guy has failed. And it's not just Democrats who feel that way. There are a lot of Trump supporters. There are a lot of moderate voters in the middle of the country who are suffering, who are looking at the hash that President Trump has made of the pandemic. And that's why I'm cautiously optimistic that things are going to go head in the right direction. And just, the last week, the president, the first lady, members of the top White House staff all come down with COVID-19. Nonetheless, they're still not wearing masks. They're still not engaging in social distancing. I mean, it's just really hard to understand what's going on. And I think I speak for many Americans.
Bill?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just say that one way to put it, I think Trump never succeeded in expanding his base. I would have slightly bet against his reelection even a year ago. He was behind in the polls slightly and had never really improved above about 45% in his approval rating. But he was certainly in the game. He may still be slightly in the game, but much less so. And that's because a year ago, the concerns that someone like me had about his foreign policy, even about various aspects of domestic policy, the rule of law, they seemed more theoretical to a lot of voters. They were longer-term concerns, or even if they weren't that long-term, they didn't speak to the pocketbooks, to the experiences of an average voter necessarily. I could be very worried about the rule of law, but, the country's still functioning and so forth. This past year, it's really been brought home. I think the price we're paying both for the total mismanagement of the coronavirus, of the pandemic, the economic consequences of that, and the divisiveness. I'm struck, I as you said, Sasha, at the beginning of this, very involved in this Republican voters against Trump, it's surprising how many of these voters are not simply moved by the economy or the pandemic, but by the riots, by the divisiveness. And they themselves could be quite conservative in many ways. They're not such big fans of, Black Lives Matter or of radical police reform, but they just think you can't have a country where you have they see the consequences of having a president, not a governor, not a senator, not a talk radio host, not a lot of rabble-rousers on the fringes or even in the Congress, but the actual president just continually exacerbating divisions, making people angrier, playing on anxieties. That's something we've been pretty well spared in this country for a long time. We've had demagogic senators, governors, as I say, talk radio, you name it, but not presidents usually, not always, but usually have tried to pacify the country at key moments, not exacerbate divisions. And I think people have been struck by just the price we're now paying for that, and they don't really want that for 4 more years.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, if my information is correct, we do have another participant at our discussion. We should have the Portuguese ambassador in Prague, Mr. Luis Almeida Sampaio, who would love to raise the question to you too. So, Ambassador Sampaio, are you there?
I am.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, Sasha. Hello, Charles and Bill. I am the ambassador of Portugal in Prague, but I was the ambassador of Portugal to NATO before, and before that to Berlin. And I worked in the private office of Manfred Werner during the critical, historical years of biggest changes across Europe. I am not going to comment, obviously, on internal US politics, as you may imagine, but I would like to focus on a key aspect of the international relations landscape. You mentioned, and very well so, the big challenges to liberal democracies, the rise of China, Russia, all the other challenges that we could also go over, and they are many and they are very serious. But in my opinion, the key dimension for an international rules-based order and for a stable multilateral world is the transatlantic relationship. Without a sound transatlantic relationship, there is no West, there is no future to protect, to defend our democracies, our way of life, and the multilateral rules-based order. And the transatlantic relationship is embodied in NATO. NATO is really the home of the transatlantic relationship. And the gap between the two sides of the Atlantic did not start with Donald Trump. At the very beginning, at the very inception of the first Obama administration, the focus was much more on the Pacific, on Southeast Asia, rather than on bringing together more and more the two sides of the Atlantic. So the first part of my comment/question is what should be done from the United States side in order really not only to preserve but also to deepen, to foster the transatlantic relationship, not only because of the security burden sharing, Wales commitment, financial side of the equation, but also because of the fact that the transatlantic relationship embodies the values that join or should join the two sides, bring together the two sides of the Atlantic. So first question, what should be done from the US side? And then here on the European continent, we have also reasons to be blamed. Some sought the opportunity of this US administration and the drive of the previous administration towards the Pacific and Southeast Asia as a window to deepen the so-called strategic autonomy of Europe. So instead of focusing on reinforcing the European pillar of NATO, and that should be really the name of the game, to reinforce our common security by reinforcing the European pillar of NATO, they sought to create the so-called strategic autonomy, and even some spoke about the creation of an European army. That is extremely, extremely damaging to the transatlantic bond. And so I think that the second part of my question, the second part of the equation, what should the Europeans do from their side in order to create the conditions for both sides of the Atlantic to come together in a reinforced way to finally be able, as the patrons of liberal democracies, to face the challenges of a much more assertive and revisionist Russia and the rise of China that remains an autocratic regime. Thank you, Sasha. It is very nice to see you again, and also our American friends.
Thank you, Ambassador. I in particular appreciate your comments because I fully agree with what you have said. And before I would ask our two guests to respond to your question, maybe I would add some additional very concrete question. 4 years ago, when Trump was taking in office, we were afraid of one thing in Europe, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, that due to the rising China and the challenge of China, there could be a temptation on the American side simply to sell us to the Russians in a way that, in a mirror model of what Henry Kissinger did in the early 1970s, when the United States were playing short-handed with the Soviet Union. They switched the Chinese with the Chinese side. So we were afraid that there could be a temptation in Washington, and Trump is a businessman. So if he gets some offer from Russia, which would be more attractive than from Europe, that he simply can sell us to the Russians, to put it straightforward. So my question is that in second term, whether there is this kind of a danger if he is going to continue, or in one hand, if Joe Biden wins, what you expect. But please, of course, respond also to our Portuguese friends' question, because it's more general and very important one. So now maybe we can start with Bill, and then Charles would follow.
I mean, I guess, no, I don't. It's a big question, and the aspects to it. I guess I put it this way, I'm thinking about it as the ambassador spoke. My friend Bob Kagan, who you all know, and with whom I co-authored many, many pieces in the 90s and early 2000s, famously wrote that short book and famously quipped or said that, that we were Americans from Mars and Europe is from Venus. I mean, we seemed very different at the height of the differences over Iraq, and broader differences in a sense about the shape of the world to come, the EU dream, which could be overly characterized or in a cartoonish way, maybe, as peace and harmony and transcending history and transcending war, no need for military force and so forth. And then the U.S., which had a different attitude after 9/11. I think those differences seem much less now. I mean, I don't think we seem like two different planets, because we're both committed to liberal democracy, and which is under real threat. Not just sort of theoretical threat, or China many, many thousands of miles away, gradually building its economy, but in a very real way, including at home in the case of the U.S. and in many European countries, one sees a real erosion of what seemed to be a consensus for liberal democracy for all of our differences, which I think in a way is therefore forced those of us who care a lot about liberal democracy, liberal institutions, both at home and abroad, to perhaps pull together. So there's a chance to build anew. I wouldn't say rebuild, because it's a new world, so it has to be thought about in a new way, but to build anew a little bit in the way people did perhaps 70, 75 years ago, a genuine alliance of liberal democracies, which then Charles and I can argue, I suppose, about how aggressive the U.S. should be in promoting that abroad and so forth, but a real commitment, whether it's a Bush-McCain type commitment or more of an Obama type commitment, and Biden maybe is a little bit in between, I guess, to defending liberal democracy and to fighting both, not just theoretically, but very practically, the dangers and the appeals of authoritarianism.
I would add
Charles.
that... should I go ahead, Sasha?
Go ahead.
Okay. I sort of think about the problem from the inside out. That is to say that the first order of business, assuming that Joe Biden were to win, would be to work inside the United States to make the country recognizable and functional again. I think Bill and I would both agree that in many respects, American political life has just really gone down the drain in terms of the open racism, the intercommunal divisions, the polarization, the insults across the aisle, and I think the lack of trust in democratic institutions. And so even if NATO exists and the institutions exist, we need to get our democratic societies back on their feet. And this is a common problem. Britain is suffering through a very strange political moment. Hungary, Poland, other countries in the EU So this is a collective agenda, and we can talk about it together. But it does strike me that if we don't get the kind of democratic spirit back in good shape inside our countries, it's never going to work among our countries. The second task would be to rebuild transatlantic solidarity. And, you know, having worked with Joe Biden on almost a daily basis for almost 3 years, I can assure you that it's hard to find somebody who's more of an Atlanticist. It's in his DNA. He went to Ukraine 6 times as vice president. He was always on the phone to Poroshenko and others. He cares deeply about the link between the United States and Europe, and he would invest in rebuilding that link, both institutionally, but also the deeper democratic roots of the relationship. Is there still going to be a kind of pivot to Asia? Sure. I mean, China is in some ways the big story of our time. And coming to one question that you raised, Sasha, one implication of a Trump second term, as far as I'm concerned, is that would effectively push Europe into the arms, not just of the Russians, but of the Chinese. Not because they want to go that direction, but because I think they would feel that the Atlantic option becomes more and more remote if the American people select Trump for 4 more years. My final point, I think this debate about strategic autonomy and EU security versus NATO security is to some extent a red herring. My view is that the more capable Europe becomes, the more Europe invests in military capability, we will figure out how to make use of it, and the more attention the United States will pay to Europe because Europe is a better partner. So I think we should spend less time arguing about the theology of institutions and more time arguing about how Europeans can pool sovereignty and invest better in defense capability, and then we will figure out how to make the best use of it.
If I may go back to China for a while, because without any doubts, it's the greatest challenger for the United States. There is, I think, a large majority of Americans, what I see in many public opinion polls like Pew Foundation, so 75% of Americans are afraid of China. So if you expect Joe Biden to win, what is your, because Charles is more realist, as I remember from the foreign policy studies, Bill tends to work more idealism. But there's one thing in common. China is a challenger, both as a very authoritarian system, so is a challenger for ideals. And at the same time, China is also a challenger in terms of the realpolitik. So what do you expect Joe Biden would do if he wins to match this China challenge? Would he select let's say, the weapons rather from the ideological arsenal, or would he play this also in the terms of the power politics and the balance of power? Charles.
I think that the U.S. relationship with China will, under the best of circumstances, be fraught and bumpy in the years ahead, regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins. And that's because there are underlying conflicts of interest over geopolitics, over trade, over human rights, over politics. And we know from history that when you have a new rising power, the reigning hegemon, to put it in political science terms, doesn't feel comfortable, and there is usually rising tension over the relationship as that power dynamic kicks in. I do think that you would see a different emphasis if Joe Biden came in several respects. One is that there would be China policy. I don't think we really have policy on anything right now. We have tweets. The president tweets something, and then the Washington community scrambles to figure out what he meant and to catch up. And so there really isn't a systematic orientation on really and anything, including China. A second area where I think Biden would be different is I think there would be a united front on the trade issue. That is to say, rather than picking a trade fight with everybody under the sun, as Trump has done, I think Biden would try to stand shoulder to shoulder with our key trading partners, such as Japan, South Korea, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and put pressure on China collectively to play by the rules and level the playing field. Final point is I think there would be more of a strategic dialogue with China. There is no real sustained conversation with the Chinese about anything. It's about tweets, it's about photo opportunities, but there's no real substance. I think that Biden would try to restore some kind of functioning strategic dialogue with Beijing. Whether that would succeed in improving the relationship and breaking through on some of the many issues of conflict, that is too soon to tell.
Bill?
Yeah, it's so hard to, I think Charles is undoubtedly right in what a President Biden would want to do. And, the world might stay quiet for a while and allow him to do more. Things could blow up in so many different ways. I mean, the degree to which we have been silent, from my point of view, about Hong Kong and about the Uyghurs, and just failed to make the most basic arguments for human rights and for treating people decently is, I think, wrong, a big mistake. The Chinese regime is both very strong and possibly quite weak. You just never know with these kinds of dictatorships. And it's both, had huge successes and somewhat has been drained of legitimacy in the sense that it is a little bit like France in the 1780s, perhaps, where the legitimacy is based on success. If they ever just hit a bigger bump in the road economically or in other ways, one wonders what happens internally. So in which case, the best thing we can do is simply be strong and ready, strong internally. That's absolutely right that Charles stressed that. And have strong relationships with our democratic allies there and elsewhere. So I don't know that I have any particular theory about China. People are too quick to assume, as with everything else, the Soviet Union was going to last forever, or this Chinese regime is going to last forever. Things change. The best thing you can do when things change is ready and and make sure the forces of liberal democracy are strong and robust, both internally and in terms of cooperating among themselves.
Well, I remember 20 years ago, at the turn of millennium, you were both trying, to predict, to make some kind of a prediction for 21st century. Charles Kupchan wrote this book about the end of the American era and recommending, the U.S. to play in equilibrium. Bill Kristol has established this project for the new American century, strongly favoring, the continuation of the U.S. leadership. In the last couple of years, we were somehow stuck between the promise of let's make America great again, and on the other hand, the evaluation that there is no U.S. leadership at all. So if I ask you now as the political scientist, what is your prediction for the U.S. role in the world, not for the whole 21st century, but at least for the next 30 years after all what has happened? So I don't know who is willing to respond first. Maybe Bill is smiling, so Bill, the turn is yours now.
That's pretty tough, Sasha. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how many of us predicted many of these things over the last 40, 50 years. Historians and political scientists look back and it all looks kind of orderly. Truman invented whatever he invented, and then things played out. And of course, you forget the incredible back and forth and chaos of Korea and Vietnam and the 70s and 80s and Europe and here, and then the suddenness of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I always have that caution in making predictions. I mean, I think I know what I would like, but I came to Washington in 1985 as a young person working in domestic politics, really, in the Reagan administration. And I just assumed, like every young conservative Reaganite anti-communist of that era, that was kind of what we would be doing for the next 20, 30, 40 years, trying to weaken the Soviet Union. No one expected 1989. So the lesson I take from that is the limits of what one can predict. But I guess I do think it is unlikely that the history of the next 25 years will be a happy history if the U.S. withdraws from the world, if we go to an America First policy, or even a sort of, let's call it a nicer version of America First, where we just assume that the democracies will do fine elsewhere and that the people who believe in freedom will do fine, and the arc of history bends towards freedom or justice, and so we don't have to do too much. I guess I'm sufficiently skeptical about that that things work out necessarily on their own, that I'm for, a strong U.S. leadership role, and then we can debate exactly what that should be and how that would work out in practice. So I'm skeptical that we'll have a happy 21st century with a withdrawn or weakened, self-weakened United States.
Charles?
I think Donald Trump has brought together individuals of disparate ideological orientation, because there isn't much daylight between Bill and myself on any of the issues that we've been talking about, which is comforting to me. I guess I would number one say that the first order of business is, as I mentioned, to get our own house in order. Like Bill, I think that the United States, working with its democratic allies, has on balance bent the arc of history in the right direction. And I'm not sure that will continue if the United States and its key democratic allies are stumbling like they are today. And I would simply say, we are living through an extraordinarily dangerous moment. Complacency is unwise at this time because things are happening in the world that I never thought imaginable. The plain and ugly truth is that nativism actually works reasonably well, and that we've seen people like Trump and other leaders around the world appeal to people's darker instincts for political gain, and it has to some extent worked. And we need to make sure that we beat back that tide. Otherwise, I do fear that the kind of liberal anchor of the world is going to continue to deteriorate. Second point I'd make is that even if the West comes back to its senses and solidarity is rebuilt, it's going to operate in a new world. And what I mean by that is, the U.S. and its democratic partners used to represent the lion's share of global GDP and military spending. And over time, as China rises, as India rises, as other countries come online, that kind of traditional community of democracies is going to have to share leadership, is going to have to work with non-democracies and other countries to sustain a rules-based order. That's not going to be easy. It's important, however, to keep that in mind. I think it would be a mistake for the Biden people to come in under a rubric of restoration, of renewal, of rebuilding. As he says, you got to build back better. That's true not just at home, but abroad, because we will be operating in a new political, economic, and geopolitical environment. But as I said, Sasha, this is perhaps the most important political moment of our lifetimes. We should be aware of that and realize that our first and second and third priorities are to get our own houses in order. If our lights are not on at home, we're never going to be able to deal with the Russias and Chinas of the world.
We here in Europe, particularly in Central Europe, we were happy and lucky if the United States were like a beacon of freedom and the values. So we have 2 minutes remaining. So very quick answers to my last question. So once you put your house in order, is there a danger of United States isolating in itself or not? Charles.
I'll take a quick stab. I think that the U.S. does have to retrench, particularly from the quote unquote forever wars in the Middle East, to make sure that its foreign policy enjoys the support of the public. So I view a kind of retrenchment, a trimming of the sails, as a way of rebuilding support for core missions. In other words, the United States needs to step back, but it would be a huge mistake to step away. We learned that the hard way in the 1930s when the U.S. stood by idly in the face of Japanese and Nazi Germany's military aggression. We need to make sure that that never happens again.
Thank you. And Bill?
I mean, short term, there's obviously, and you saw this with both President Obama and President Trump, a certain weariness with the wars. I could argue against that. I could argue that Syria, the non-intervention in Syria has been more disastrous than all of our interventions, but I'm not sure that that would be a majority view in the U.S. But I don't think over the medium term and longer term, the U.S. is going to be able to persuade itself, and our citizens will persuade themselves that they'll be just fine in a world in which we don't pay any attention to things like climate change and world health on the one hand, or the possibilities of nuclear proliferation, or authoritarian regimes flexing their muscles, intervening in our elections, and so forth on the other. So I think reality will force the U.S. back into a reasonably internationalist mode.
Thank you very, very much. We have 8 remaining seconds, so I just wish you all the best, and hopefully we'll stay engaged together in the West. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Sasha and Charles.
Nice to see you both. Take care.
Well, good evening. Welcome to a coffee table conversation. We will be discussing today basically the highlights of day 2 of Forum 2000. It's great to be listening and hearing all the amazing speakers that we've heard for the last 2 days. Joining me tonight are Nyaradzo Mashayamombe from Zimbabwe and Šarūnas Liekis from Lithuania, sharing their highlights. I would like to share what I personally took away from day 2, even though the first day, I really enjoyed the first day. Today, for me, the most interesting takeaways were from the panel called Will Authoritarians Shape the Norms of a Digital Era? And there were several really interesting points mentioned, but my takeaways would be something that one of the speakers, Garrick Asparov, mentioned about technology and it being agnostic. Also, the fact that democratic world needs to develop shared strategy. And I think this was repeated over and over again in most of the panels since day 1. And I think this is probably one of the common conclusions from the Forum 2000 until today. And also a point about values. Values are integral in these efforts. And I absolutely agree, especially once again, kind of drawing on many of the comments and statements and presentations made during this Forum 2000, just how important values are. I'll pass on the floor to my wonderful panelists. Perhaps who would like to take the floor? The floor is yours. Maybe Nyaradzo would like to start.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Zimbabwe. It's in the evening. So I will try to give my takeaways from the 3 panels that really struck a chord for me. The first panel was, are we really the end of responsible citizenry? And so for me, as a person who also works in the grassroots, it was really an interesting panel to note that one of the speakers actually thought that strong citizenry actually equals strong civil society to make governments accountable. So when citizens are strengthened, when they're educated, when they're empowered, governments are actually able to be held accountable. Then civil society is able to work with the citizens, and the citizens are able to hold their leadership accountable. And then we learned that in Georgia, for example, there was an emphasis on the need for strong grassroots activism. So have stronger voices. And then there was also the issue of voting for populistic leaders, which was alluded to be killing democracy. We are seeing this across the world, actually, even in Africa, where it's no longer even within the opposition themselves. It's about populism, people voting for populistic leaders, not necessarily the substance that those leaders are bringing. And then we see that another panelist mentioned the issue of the growing freedom of speech. However, there was a quick mention that while the freedom of speech is growing, there's also the backlash of the misuse of technology, which has become harmful as well. And then there was also a mention that more and more citizens are asking leadership important questions. Again, an example was given about women who are beginning to ask to say, if I vote for you, how is my life going to change? And so that was actually an amazing story, actually, from that panel. And then there was a conversation on Asia, the new center of the global battle of ideas. I was very interested in this sense that I felt a sense that the whole panel, the world is recognizing the impact of China, and so the assertiveness of China seems to be rocking the world and leading the global order through its authoritarian tactics, including the way it is. Including the way it handled the coronavirus. So there was actually a mention of how the authoritarian leadership of China, which was said to be lacking of transparency, whereas if it had shared if it had been more transparent, information would have been shared earlier, and the global spread of coronavirus would not have happened. But it was also recognized that the same tactics of authoritarian surveillance, use of technology, actually was then used by China to combat the coronavirus at the end, when coronavirus was now raging havoc across the world. There was also a mention of how China's authoritarian surveillance and I mentioned how this has actually affected how it enabled the control of the coronavirus. There was also an interesting question on whether the relations with China and countries such as the US threaten a world war, a cold world war. Yeah. So that was a question that I also found very interesting. Just for the alluding of the fact that China seems to be increasing its assertiveness, its aggression, its tactics, and also it was recognized that at the same time the United States, during its own election, seems to now be playing the hate China card, which is also populistic. So it's also something that I realized that was interesting in that. So it was also interesting also to note that a suggestion from one speaker who urged the superpowers to also compete with China on its impact on Africa. As an African, I found that very, very interesting, that urging that China cannot be left. Maybe I think the point was China cannot be left unchecked. Therefore, other people must intervene and see what China is doing in countries such as in Africa. And lastly, the activated citizenry was my third panel, where there was a discussion on the need for change in tactics for engaging for pro-democracy protests. And one speaker actually said that they moved from just being an activist to being a politician. And I hope I got that right. And there was actually a conversation around the need for activists to begin and start their own political party to bring an alternative. So for now, I think that was my major takeaways.
That's a very extensive overview of what you thought important. But I think also just to add that populism, I feel like it was mentioned over and over again, pretty much since day one, the rise in populism, the authoritarian regimes and how they're using technology, whether for surveillance purposes or how the use of surveillance technology actually increased during the pandemic, especially among the authoritarian regimes. My next panelist, I would also like to hear a few words from Šarūnas. Please share with us your takeaways from day 2.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting to speak. This is the first time I'm speaking in this kind of capacity in a distance mode, and this is a big honor. At the same time, I want to say that this is kind of very not only to have honor of speaking with you, but also kind of privilege to see everything from a distance. And this kind of distance allows you a little bit, to be kind of to give everything in the retrospective, because many of the topics, when though you're outside, but very close to Czech Republic, this allows you to see, to have your angle. And actually, when you are physically present at the conference, this kind of angle you can express much easier than sitting a few hundred kilometers or thousands of kilometers away. I mean, I'm sitting a few hundred kilometers away, and this allows you to have more kind of let's say different perspective on everything, because the best is seen when you are from outside. So I think this event which we had for a couple of days is important, because it allows all of us to see it from outside. Because before we would sit in the hall in beautiful Prague, and right now we are, everybody is sitting outside, and he has his own perspective on everything. At the same time, on the panels as well, and at the same time is not able actively to bring in, their own angle. So. When I'm looking at the program and looked at the sessions, for example, the stand with Belarus. I mean, because they are the neighbors, very close to us, and from the very beginning we were following the story closely. There was engagement of all different parties in our country, in Lithuania. So politicians, civil society, Tsikhanovskaya herself, she's here. So it allows you her presentations and the whole discussion on Belarus allows you to see it also in a certain way with the Czech eyes and with the eyes of the other participants. And this is a great contribution towards understanding of importance of the whole movement in Belarus, because very often, there is a local political context. In Lithuania, the elections were coming, they're looming, so the politicians were very active. At the same time, you see the importance of the whole movement for the human rights and prevention of torture by the police, for example, how it's important for the human rights generally, not only for the self-determination, political self-determination of the people of Belarus. And this naturally topic is closely related to activated citizens, because Belarusian topic and activated citizens naturally both topics are interrelated. The rest, for example, I noticed that on some other issues, for example, COVID in Latin America, completely unknown for everybody and for me including, you hear about the numbers in Brazil, you hear the numbers in Argentina. or in Peru, but it doesn't relate very much, in reality to what we see here in Europe and the way it's handled in Europe. So I think it helps in terms of not only of knowledge, but also in terms of real experience and real exchange of views, not only from the point of how the crisis is managed, but also from the point of the practitioners. To what extent practitioners are able to share the experience and to apply experience in certain countries. For example, let's say Brazil, and how you can bring this experience to Turkey, let's say, or or to Lithuania or to Czech Republic. So this is very important. Then I would like also to stress the session on liberal order of war, and this session is very interesting. Apart from many things which are in circulation around us, I mean the main issues related to present tensions, especially China-focused issues like Hong Kong, Taiwan. We see many things that are related to technological rivalry between major players, international major players, the role of China in all these tensions. And I think the main contribution of this session is especially important because it talks about peace and war. And as we know, all our efforts, all our efforts in everyday life and in our, aims, the purpose, what we are doing in our everyday job is related to one extent or another extent to the preservation of peace. Because otherwise, in war, you get destroyed everything. And so the question of peace and war is of great importance to everybody. And the fact that this kind of long relative peace and stability of post-Second World War era that connects us to the liberal international order, and we have to thank this international law order for such a long period of peace. At the same time, we witness, protracted civil wars that are lasting already as well. In many corners of the world, and in Europe is not excluded. Post-socialist, for example, destruction of ex-Yugoslavia, in ex-Soviet sphere of influence. If you take, for example, post-Soviet republics, the conflicts over there, Transnistria, Tajikistan, and right now we're speaking about Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh is, in everybody's mouth, when we're speaking about major tensions around. And however, it's important that the major players are seeing the possibility.
I'm sorry, Shamunas, we will need to wrap up because we're over time.
Okay. And so it's important that the main leaders and the main players of the international scene, they are maintaining and strengthening peace. And though we speak about blurred bipolarity, sometimes we slip in some of the regions into multipolarity because of the nature of politics in the United States and China, for example, and especially U.S. factors influencing this kind of us moving into the direction of multipolarity. And so all the alternatives from the liberal order should be taken seriously. So because I'm over my time, so I'd like, to thank for the attention, and I hope I helped somehow, to highlight the main points.
I think it was great. Thank you so much. I wish this time that we allocated for us was a little longer because obviously, as you can see, we can just, continue talking about our, highlights and takeaways. But one thing on Tikhanovskaya, I think it was really important to have her speak at Forum 2000 and address the audience and share what is being discussed within the movement and what's happening on the ground. And of course, one thing that she mentions when she's asked what do people of Belarus want, the word respect. I think that's sort of, wraps it all really neatly into one package. I would like to thank everyone who participated today, who attended the sessions. Don't forget and join the third day of Forum 2000 tomorrow, once again starting at 2 o'clock. I personally am looking forward to a session with Derek Mitchell, Can Dündar, and Shirin Ebadi. It's called Autocracies on the March. And I'm pretty sure the women rights in time of crisis is also going to be quite fascinating. So lots of really interesting panels to look forward to tomorrow. Tune in, don't forget, and thank you so much for watching. Bye, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.